There are moments when a story becomes so loud that the truth inside it disappears. Not because the truth is hidden, but because it is buried under reaction. For months, that is what this situation became. Noise layered on top of noise. Accusations repeated until they felt like facts. Fragments of information stretched into certainty. And somewhere beneath all of it, a family that never chose to be part of any of it. Now pause there for a second, because this is where most people make a mistake. They assume the loudest part of a story is the most important. It rarely is. The loudest part is usually the part people can argue about. The quiet part is where the consequences actually live. And in this case, the quiet part is what changed everything. Because while the internet was debating, speculating, choosing sides, something else was happening in the background. Something structured, something procedural, something that does not operate on emotion. The kind of system that moves slowly, documents carefully, and only acts when a threshold is crossed. That is where this story shifts. Not with a viral post, not with a creator's claim, but with intervention. And that intervention produced something the audience had not experienced in months. Relief. Not performative relief. Not temporary reassurance. But something more grounded. Because the update did not come from commentary. It came from a process that is designed to assess risk, stability, and care conditions. Now consider what that means. If a system like that reports improvement, what does that imply? It implies measurable change. Not opinion. Not interpretation. Change. And that is where the emotional conflict begins. Because the update did not match the narrative people had been building. It contradicted it. Supporters had imagined distress continuing, isolation worsening, confusion deepening. Instead, what emerged was something more complicated. Stability. And not just stability in the abstract sense. Observable behavioral changes. Calmer responses. Improved regulation. Adaptation to routine. Now stop and examine that carefully. Because this is where interpretation matters. If improvement appears after a change in environment, what does that suggest about the previous environment? It suggests that the previous environment may have been unstable, not necessarily intentionally harmful, but inconsistent, unpredictable, overstimulating. Now ask the next question. What creates that kind of instability? Not a single cause, but accumulation. Visitors arriving without structure. Different people interacting in different ways. Unclear boundaries. Emotional pressure. Expectation. Noise. Routine disruption. And when those factors overlap, something specific happens. The baseline shifts. What was once manageable becomes overwhelming. What was once familiar becomes unpredictable. And for individuals who rely heavily on consistency, that shift is not minor. It is structural. Now consider the three individuals at the center of this update, each with different needs, different sensitivities, different thresholds, and yet the report suggests a shared outcome. Improvement. That is not coincidence. That is correlation, which leads to a necessary question. What changed? The answer is not a single event. It is removal of variables, reduction of unpredictability, introduction of routine, monitoring, consistency. Now consider how that contrasts with what came before. A home environment that had become increasingly open, increasingly observed, increasingly influenced by external actors. Some well-intentioned, some not, but all adding input, all adding pressure, all adding variation. Now think about what that does over time. Even without malicious intent, it fragments stability. And once stability fragments, everything built on it begins to shift. Behavior, mood, energy, response patterns, and most importantly, the ability to regulate. Now return to the present. The update says improvement, but improvement does not exist in isolation. It exists in contrast. It reflects difference, and that difference points backward, not to assign blame, but to identify conditions. Now consider the emotional response from supporters. Relief, yes, but also discomfort, because improvement in the present forces a question about the past. And that question is difficult, because it suggests that what people believed was helping may have also been contributing to instability. Now pause again, because this is where the conversation becomes important. Not emotional, not reactive, but analytical. If attention increases pressure, if access increases unpredictability, if involvement increases variation, then what is the effect on a fragile environment? It becomes less stable, not because of one person, but because of cumulative impact. Now take the next step. What about Betty? Because this is where the story shifts again. Most people focused on the visible, on the individuals being filmed, observed, discussed. But the structure of that household relied on one central point: care coordination, routine maintenance, emotional management. And that point was a single person. Now ask a simple question. What happens when the central point becomes overwhelmed? The entire system destabilizes. Not instantly, but gradually, and often invisibly, until a threshold is reached. Now consider what the report suggests. Not failure, but strain. Not neglect, but overload. And that distinction matters, because overload is not about intention. It is about capacity, and capacity has limits. Now think about the convergence of factors: external attention, internal responsibility, emotional pressure, environmental decline, financial limitation, and no structured support system to absorb any of it. That is not a stable configuration. That is a system under pressure. And systems under pressure do not fail all at once. They degrade, subtly, until something forces intervention. Now return to the update. Improvement, stability, regulation, and the possibility, still unconfirmed, still uncertain, of controlled visitation. Now ask one final question for this part. If stability required removal from that environment, what does that say about what that environment had become? And more importantly, what does it say about how easily good intentions can create unintended outcomes? Comment one word. Relief if the update feels like protection. Concern if it raises questions about what came before. Or uncertain if you think the situation is still not fully understood. Because the next part moves deeper into what actually triggered the intervention, and why that moment changes how this entire timeline is understood. There is always a moment in situations like this where speculation reaches its limit. Not because people stop asking questions, but because the structure of the event forces a different kind of answer. Up to this point, most explanations have centered on what was visible. The videos, the visitors, the arguments, the attention. All of those things are real. All of those things mattered, but none of them, on their own, explain why intervention happens when it does. Because intervention does not respond to noise. It responds to thresholds. That distinction is critical. A system can tolerate noise for a long time. It cannot tolerate risk that crosses a defined boundary. So the question becomes precise. What crossed the boundary? Not publicly, not dramatically, but operationally. And this is where the story changes direction. Because the trigger was not something that could be clipped, shared, or debated in a comment section. It was something quieter. Something that only becomes visible when you are looking for patterns instead of moments. And those patterns were already forming. Slowly, consistently. Indications that something was no longer holding. Now pause and examine that idea carefully. A system does not collapse because of a single event. It collapses because of accumulated strain. And strain reveals itself in signals. Small at first, easily dismissed, then gradually more consistent. Harder to ignore, until finally undeniable. Now consider what those signals looked like in this case. Changes in behavior. Not dramatic enough to go viral, but noticeable enough to be recorded. Mood fluctuations that did not align with routine. Fatigue that did not resolve with rest. Responses that became less predictable. Not isolated incidents. Patterns. Now ask the next question. Who notices patterns like that? Not an audience. Not a viewer. Not someone watching from a distance. People trained to observe deviation from baseline. That is the difference, because the audience sees moments. Professionals track continuity, and continuity tells a different story. Now take one example. A shift in responsiveness. To an outside observer, it may appear minor. A quieter reaction. A delayed response. A different expression. But within a structured assessment, that shift is data. It is compared to prior behavior, measured against expected range. And if it appears consistently, it becomes a signal. Now multiply that across multiple individuals. Different responses. Same direction. That is not coincidence. That is correlation. And correlation leads to evaluation. Now consider the environment at that time. Not in abstract terms, but in operational terms. How many people had access? How often did routines change? How consistent were interactions? How predictable was the day-to-day structure? Because predictability is not a preference in these situations. It is a requirement. Remove predictability, and you introduce variability. Introduce variability, and you increase cognitive and emotional load. Increase load, and you reduce capacity to regulate. Now ask yourself something simple. If someone is already operating near their limit, what happens when you add more variables? They adapt for a while. Then they compensate. Then they begin to show signs of strain. And eventually, they cannot compensate anymore. That is the progression. And it is often invisible until it is not. Now bring that back to the reported update. Improvement. What does improvement imply? That the previous state included strain. Not necessarily visible. Not necessarily intentional. But present. Now we move to the moment that changed the trajectory. The trigger. Not a video. Not an argument. Not a public conflict. A health event. But even that term needs to be understood correctly. Because people often imagine a health event as something dramatic. Something obvious. Something that forces immediate reaction. That is not always the case. Some of the most critical health indicators are subtle. A change in breathing pattern. A shift in energy level. An alteration in responsiveness. A deviation from baseline behavior that only makes sense when you know what baseline is. Now consider this. If a person shows signs that their system is under strain, and those signs align with environmental instability, then the risk is not hypothetical. It is present. And once risk becomes present, the response changes. Not emotional. Procedural. Now ask the key question. Why act at that moment and not earlier? Because thresholds are cumulative. Each signal adds weight. Each pattern adds evidence. Until the combined assessment reaches a point where inaction becomes the greater risk. That is when intervention occurs. Not when people are arguing. Not when attention peaks. But when the internal assessment crosses its limit. Now consider what that means in this context. The intervention was not a reaction to the internet. It was a response to conditions. And those conditions included something deeper than chaos. They included structural decline. Now pause again, because this is where the second layer of the story begins. Most people focused on behavior, on interaction, on attention, but there was another factor operating quietly in the background. The environment itself. And environments, like people, have limits. They can absorb stress for a time. Then they begin to degrade. And when they degrade, they introduce risk. Not always immediately visible, but cumulative. Now think about the description of the home over time. Not as a snapshot, but as a system. Aging structure. incremental repairs, workarounds instead of solutions, increased use, increased traffic, increased strain. Now combine that with external pressure, more visitors, more movement, more activity, and ask a simple question. What happens to a structure already under stress when you increase its load? It deteriorates faster, not because of one action, but because of accumulation. Now link that to the individuals inside that environment. If the environment becomes less stable, then the conditions inside it become less predictable. And unpredictability is not neutral. It is stress. Now return to the moment of intervention. It was not just about a person. It was about a system. A system where human strain and environmental strain were converging. And once those two align, the risk multiplies. Now consider Betty again, because this is where the understanding deepens. She was not only managing people, she was managing the environment, maintaining structure, compensating for deficiencies, adapting constantly, and doing all of that without external stabilization. Now ask yourself something honestly. How long can one person sustain that level of responsibility under increasing pressure? Not indefinitely. And that is not a failure. It is a limit. Now imagine that limit being reached gradually. Sleep disrupted, energy reduced, decision-making strained, emotional capacity stretched thin, and all of that happening while external pressure continues to increase. That is not sustainable. And systems that are not sustainable eventually trigger intervention. Now return to the present again. The update reports improvement. But improvement did not come from adding more. It came from reducing variables, from stabilizing inputs, from controlling the environment, from introducing consistency, and from removing the pressure that had been building. Now ask one more question. If stability required removal from that environment, what does that imply about what the environment had become? Not a home in the traditional sense, but a system under strain. And systems under strain do not recover on their own. They require restructuring. Now this leads to a more difficult realization, because it challenges a common assumption, that attention equals help. Sometimes it does, but not always. Sometimes attention introduces variables that destabilize the very thing people are trying to protect. And that is the paradox at the center of this story. Now consider where that leaves the situation. The individuals are reported as improving. The environment has been removed from the equation. The central caregiver has been relieved of immediate pressure. And the system is now structured differently. That is not an ending. That is a reset. And resets create new questions about what happens next, about how stability is maintained, about whether the conditions that cause the initial strain can be prevented from retaining, and most importantly, about whether the same patterns could repeat if the structure is not carefully managed. So now the question shifts, not from what happened, but from what happens next. Comment one word. Stability, if you believe the current structure will hold. Temporary, if you think this is only a short-term improvement. Or unknown if you think there are still variables we cannot see. Because the next part moves into the most difficult layer of this entire situation. The human cost of the reset. And what recovery actually looks like when stability comes after collapse. When people hear that a situation has improved, they often imagine a clean transition. From bad to better, from unstable to stable, from chaos to calm. But real transitions are not clean. They are uneven. They carry residue. And most importantly, they carry cost. Because stability, when it comes after disruption, is not the same as stability that was always there. It is constructed. And construction always requires something to be taken apart first. So now the question changes again. Not what triggered the intervention. Not what changed structurally. But what did it cost to get here? Because that is the part most updates do not include. Now consider the word that surfaced quietly in the background of all this. Scattered. not confirmed in a formal report, not stated in a headline, but repeated enough to matter. And if that word is even partially accurate, it carries weight, because it describes a condition that is the opposite of what this family had been for decades. Together, now pause and sit with that contrast. For years, the defining feature of this household was proximity, shared space, shared routine, shared dependency, and suddenly, that configuration changes. Now ask the simplest question. What happens when a system built on togetherness is separated? It does not simply continue in a different form. It reconfigures. And reconfiguration is not neutral. It affects memory, attachment, behavior, identity. Now consider each individual within that change, not as a group, but as separate points within the system, because each one experiences disruption differently. For someone who relies heavily on routine, separation is not just emotional. It is structural. It removes reference points, familiar faces, familiar sounds, familiar rhythms. And when those disappear, the world does not just feel different. It becomes different. Now return to the reported improvement. Calm behavior, better regulation, stability. Now ask a difficult question. Can improvement exist alongside loss? The answer is yes. And that is where the complexity lies. Because improvement in one dimension does not erase disruption in another. It coexists with it. Now think about what that means in practical terms. A person may appear calmer, more regulated, less reactive, but that does not mean they have not experienced separation. It means they are adapting to a new structure. And adaptation is not the same as preference. Now consider Lorraine, a life described as existing near language but not fully within it. A life where expression is limited but perception may still be present. Now ask this carefully. What happens to someone like that when their environment changes completely? They cannot explain it. They cannot ask why. They cannot articulate loss. But that does not mean they do not experience it. It means the experience exists without clear external expression. And that makes it easy to misinterpret. Silence can look like acceptance. Calm can look like comfort. But those are not always the same thing. Now consider Timmy, a person whose behavior has often been interpreted through visible actions. Smiles, sounds, movement. Now those indicators are being reported as improved, more consistent, more positive. But again, ask the same question. Is that improvement the result of comfort or the result of structure? Because those are different mechanisms. Structure can reduce stress. It can create predictability. It can stabilize responses. But it does not automatically replace attachment. Now consider Ray. Adjustment described as quick, even surprising. Now think about that carefully. Rapid adjustment can mean flexibility, but it can also mean something else. It can mean that the new structure is easier to navigate than the previous one, which again points backward, not to assign blame, but to understand conditions. Now return to Betty, because this is where the human cost becomes most visible. For years, she was the center of that system, not in a symbolic sense, in a functional sense. She coordinated everything: routine, care, food, movement, interaction, and she did it continuously. Now that role changes, not gradually, abruptly. Now ask what that does to a person, not abstractly, but concretely. What happens when the responsibility that defined your daily life is suddenly removed? There are two immediate effects: relief and disorientation. Relief because the pressure is gone. Disorientation because the structure is gone. Now consider how those two interact. Relief allows the body to rest. Disorientation forces the mind to reorient. And that combination can feel unstable. Now add another layer. Emotional weight. Separation from the people she cared for. Uncertainty about their condition. Limited access. Limited control. Now ask again. Is this a resolution, Or is it a transition? Because those are not the same thing. Now consider the idea of visitation. Not confirmed, not scheduled, but discussed. And that word matters, because it introduces possibility, but not certainty. And possibility creates a different kind of tension. Hope. Now ask what hope does in this context. It lifts, but it also risks disappointment. Because if expectations form without structure, they can destabilize again. Now consider the system as it stands now. Structured environment, professional oversight, controlled interaction, reduced variables. That system is stable, but it is also conditional. It depends on maintaining those conditions. Now ask the next logical question. What happens if those conditions change again? What happens if access increases? If interaction becomes less controlled? If external pressure returns? Does the system remain stable, or does it begin to shift again? Now consider the role of supporters, because this is where responsibility becomes collective, not in a legal sense, but in an influence sense. Attention does not disappear. It changes form, and how it changes will affect what happens next. Now ask something directly. If attention contributed to instability before, what form of attention would support stability now? Not silence, not abandonment, but restraint. Now think about what restraint looks like. Not showing up unannounced, not creating pressure through expectation, not demanding constant updates, not turning every development into content, because each of those actions adds variables, and variables are what destabilize the system in the first place. Now return to the idea of recovery, because that is the word people often use. But recovery is not immediate. It is incremental. It requires consistency, time, predictability, and most importantly, absence of disruption. Now ask yourself this. Is the current environment providing that? According to the update, yes. But that yes is conditional. It depends on maintaining the structure. Now consider the emotional reality. A family that was once together is now separated. Individuals are improving. The caregiver is relieved of immediate burden but facing emotional adjustment. Supporters are relieved but uncertain. That is not a resolved story. That is a stabilized system. And stabilization is not permanent. It is maintained. Now ask one final question for this part. What matters more right now? Reuniting quickly, or maintaining stability long enough for any reunion to be sustainable? Because those two goals are not always aligned, and choosing one over the other has consequences. Comment one word. Reunion, if you believe bringing them back together should be the priority. Stability, if you think maintaining the current structure matters more. Or balance, if you think both can happen carefully over time. Because the final part moves into the most difficult question of all. Not what happened, not what changed, but what responsibility looks like going forward. And whether this story ends as recovery or repeats as another cycle. At some point, every story like this reaches a place where explanation is no longer enough. Because understanding what happened does not automatically tell you what to do next. And that is where this situation now stands. Not in crisis, not in chaos, but in something quieter and more fragile. Stability that must be protected. Because stability is not self-sustaining. It depends on behavior, on boundaries, on decisions made by people who are not inside the system, but still affected. Now consider what has already been established. When variables were reduced, stability increased. When structure was introduced, behavior improved. When pressure was removed, regulation returned. That is not theory. That is observation. So the question becomes direct. What happens if those variables return? If attention increases again? If access becomes uncontrolled again? If expectations are placed back onto a system that is only just stabilizing? The answer is not uncertain. The system will begin to shift again. Maybe slowly, maybe subtly, but predictably, because the conditions that created instability before would be reintroduced. Now consider responsibility, not in terms of blame, but in terms of influence. Every viewer, every supporter, every person who feels invested in this story has influence, not individually, but collectively, and collective behavior shapes outcomes. Now ask yourself something simple. What does support actually mean in this context? Is it constant visibility, or is it allowing space for recovery? Is it demanding updates, or is it accepting limited information if it protects stability? Is it showing up, or is it stepping back? Because those choices are not neutral. They either reinforce structure, or they disrupt it. Now return to Betty, because her role has changed, but her position has not become easier. It has become different. She is no longer carrying the full operational burden, but she is carrying something else. Adjustment, uncertainty, waiting, and possibly hope that has no confirmed timeline. Now ask what helps her most. More pressure, more expectation, more noise, or something quieter. Consistency, respect, patience, because recovery is not just for those who were removed. It is also for the person who held everything together for as long as she could. Now consider the future. Reunion may happen. Visitation may happen. But if it does, it will only succeed under one condition. Structure, clear boundaries, controlled interaction. No return to the conditions that created instability in the first place. Because without that, the cycle repeats. And that is the final question. Not whether people care. That is already clear. But whether care will be expressed in a way that protects, or in a way that overwhelms again. Comment one word. Protect, if you believe the priority now is preserving stability. Or return, if you believe the focus should be bringing everything back together. Because what happens next will not be decided by one person. It will be shaped by how everyone chooses to respond from here. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.